here just for a minute and see comments that people made. There are a number of them. Let's see, Tanika, that emotional part is very real. Yeah, that's for sure. Rachel said she had the shirt experience, couldn't wear a black or green checkered blouse. Half the staff would zone out during the meetings if they were Iraq or Afghan vets, because there's the same material as their dust and sand covers. Yeah, that's a great example of that. And I love the fact that you talked about zoning out. Rachel, probably you could be doing this trauma training, so I would love to hear more comments from you about some of this stuff. But we tend to think of flashbacks and reactions as my professor, right? Which is why it's such a great example that I usually use to start this, the freaking out, screaming, punching, whatever. But just as often, we see people just kind of check out. And so we're going to pick up with that and talk exactly about that kind of range that people can move in and out of. Okay. All right. So again, I will leave some time at the end as well, so we can just sort of open things up and chat a little bit if people have comments or questions. As we're going, please feel free to put them in the chat section. I usually can't see the chat comments while I've got the slides open. So if you need me to go back to something or you want me to slow it down, because I'm from Cleveland originally, so North Coast, right? But it means that when I get really excited, I talk really fast. So if you're like, what? Just put it in there and I can go back and cover it when we wrap things up for today. But let's go ahead and get into it. And I think I can share my screen. Yes. So let's see if I can just pull this one up. There we go. All right. So let's get back into it. Yes. Okay. So before we talk about this, I do want to, one other thing. So the past few minutes with the story I told earlier and with the comment that Rachel made, we've been talking about triggers. And if you ask people in the general population about trauma or PTSD, that's a word that people are pretty familiar with. People use it, you know, trigger warnings, stuff like that. And there are times when knowing triggers are really important. So Rachel's example is perfect. And Rachel, I'll probably steal it and use it for lots of trainings from after this, because it's such a great example of there's some triggers that are obvious, right? Like my professor said after telling the class his story, that he'd kind of learned not to go to movies about Vietnam in the movie theater. And we were like, check plus, that's a great plan, right? Or if you're working with a veteran and they're like, I'm going to be missing the fireworks this year. Yes, that sounds like a good idea. But triggers can also be completely everyday stuff that you would not think about, like the pattern and color on a shirt. There's a little bit of a trap with triggers, okay? And the first one is that there are some triggers that we need to know. So Rachel knowing I can't wear this shirt because everybody will check out, that's a great example. Or, you know, if Tamika's like, I can't wear this shirt with Laura or she's going to try to punch me, good to know. And for some people you work with, if they are triggered into violence or they run screaming into the street and, you know, or they're going to run off and try to cut themselves, knowing triggers is incredibly important. But a lot of times triggers can happen and we don't know what it was. Now, again, I'm used to, in some cases, doing trainings for people where someone can't necessarily speak. So if someone has profound developmental disabilities, or sometimes with very young children, they're not always able to tell us, man, your shirt's freaking me out, right? But the other problem is this, that the brain tends to get good at whatever we ask it to do a lot of, which is great if you're trying to learn how to drive or play the piano or play baseball. It's kind of crappy when we're talking about trauma, because whatever the brain repeats gets stronger and stronger and faster. So the best example I can give you for this is, sorry, I'm not happy with what my camera is doing. The best example I can use is like, if you've ever had a smoke detector in your kitchen and it's a little too sensitive, so you burn toast and the kitchen's really smoky and it goes off and you're like, yeah, I know. And you clear all the smoke off and whatever. And now it goes off when you're just boiling eggs. And you're like, oh, I'm just boiling eggs. And then pretty soon it goes off if you're just making water for tea. Or then it starts going off if you're running hot water in the sink. And now imagine that sometimes this alarm goes off in the middle of the night. Nobody's in the kitchen at all. Who knows why, right? What can happen for some people with triggers is that they can generalize. and sort of ripple outward, if you will. Okay. So a veteran, for example, might start with, I can't be around fireworks. And now it's, I can't be around big crowds of people at night when I can't see. And now it's, I can't be around crowds of people at all. And now it's, I can't leave my house during the day. I've often thought that if you go to Walmart at like 4 a.m, you're going to see a lot of people with PTSD. Like that's when they do their shopping, right? So it can sort of ripple outward. That's the first problem. And the second problem, as I said, is sometimes we don't know what a trigger is. When I work with clients in my practice, and many of them are trauma survivors, there's some triggers that can be helpful to know, but it can also be frustrating. If it becomes this like wild goose chase, trying to figure it out, sometimes you just don't know why something set something off. It just did. So imagine an alarm system in your house or a smoke detector that sometimes just sets itself off for no reason. That's what some levels of severe trauma can be like. So I think it's important for us, if we're working with someone and we've got that relationship, if there are some triggers we know that they know, or we can help identify that, that's great. That's really helpful. But it's not going to get all of them. So I try not to get people overly focused on that. And that's not even the biggest problem. We haven't even talked about the biggest problem, focusing on triggers. And that is that it can sort of lead people away from the real problem of trauma. And that is that trauma, especially if it began in childhood, especially if it was severe, especially if it was repeated or chronic. And as I said, some of the women you serve are going to have all three. In those instances, trauma is like, it's not like a smoke detector anymore. It's like a ship at sea. Okay. So I want you to imagine a ship out on the ocean, and there's a hole in the side of the ship, and that seawater is starting to get in. At first, it might just be in one little part of the ship, right? But over time, eventually it can seep everywhere. And given enough water, that whole ship starts to sink. So trauma, especially when it happens earlier in life, especially if it's severe, especially if it's chronic, can change everything about a person. It's not just you can't wear a black and white shirt around them. Okay. So here's a little bit of what I mean when I say that. Trauma can affect how aware you are of your body, what you're sensing in your body. And that means if you can't feel what you're sensing, then you don't know what your emotions are. If you don't know what you're sensing and feeling, it's hard to know kind of where you are. So going back to that example of how we diagnose people and how we see people, there were a number of young people, again, mostly young men, but sometimes young women, who had been diagnosed with whatever they were allowed to be diagnosed with, depending on their age. Up until 18, it was conduct disorder. After 18, it was antisocial personality disorder, which basically means criminal, right? And one of the things that is a symptom of that is lack of empathy. And we definitely can see young people behaving in very unempathetic ways, right? So that seems pretty straightforward. You're a monster. You don't have feelings for other people. Okay. Here's the problem, that if it's actually undiagnosed and untreated trauma, we'll go back to that example with my professor. If you could periodically be filled with panic and horror like my professor was, as we said, you would be willing to do just about anything not to feel it. And one of the ways that we deal with that, especially trauma that starts in childhood, is we just disconnect from our feelings. We disconnect from our body, right? The trouble, well, there are a lot of problems with that, but one of the problems is in terms of dealing with other people. For me to interact empathetically with, let's say, Jessica, okay? So Jessica's face is, I don't know, she's frowning and her face is turning red and her mouth is like this. I look at that, and pheromones might even play a role actually too, but I look at her face and her body language, and in fractions of a second, I kind of bounce it off my own feelings. And I go, oh, when I'm like that, I feel angry. I think maybe Jessica's angry. Now, most, if not all of you guys do what you do partly because you're good at empathy. So this is probably very highly developed in you. And it's so fast that you're not aware of that kind of ping-ponging effect. But in order to be empathetic to the feelings of another person, we have to be able to reflect it inside our bodies. That's where feelings are, emotions are in the body. And it has to have something to bounce off of. Well, what if I've cut myself off from my feelings and my body? I'm checked out a lot of the time. I'm numb and shut down a lot of the time. And now I look at Jessica and I feel nothing because there's nothing for it to bounce off of. You guys get me on this? Now, plenty of people also grow up in situations where treating people like objects, treating people like they're a threat, get them before they get you. Some of that is more of a learned adaptation, okay? But some of the lack of empathy might be, I can't feel your feelings because I don't feel my feelings, right? And in fact, there are studies where if you start treating people like in the prison population, who've been everybody's been diagnosed a sociopath, everybody's antisocial personality disorder, whatever, but you identify and treat trauma, boom, suddenly some of these, lack of empathy sociopaths can actually empathize with other people, right? Now, obviously, I'm not saying that's everybody, and I'm not even saying they shouldn't necessarily be in prison. Maybe that's exactly where they should be. I'm just saying some of the people that we label as without empathy actually are manifesting numbness and disconnection from trauma. Okay. So just a couple of these, because I could go on and on about this, but how you fall asleep, digest food, fight off disease, and interestingly for your population, also how you experience sexual connection. Trauma can mess with all of this. Falling asleep is a fairly sophisticated, complex interaction with multiple systems in your brain. It's sensitive and it doesn't take much to throw it off. I didn't sleep very well last night because I was, thinking about and a little nervous about this training today. That's always true when I have a presentation. So it doesn't take a lot, right, to throw it off balance. And in fact, when clients come to me, if they haven't identified trauma as part of their story, often they will come because they're having trouble sleeping. And sex also, first thing out the door. Now, you can have disconnected sex, and many of the women you guys are going to work with will have a lot of experience with that. To placate people, to get something, to maintain a connection so they can maintain stability, blah, blah, blah. But having emotionally connected sex is very difficult because if you think about it, you've got this narrow little window where you need to be relaxed but activated neurologically, right? That's kind of a narrow range. And it's sensitive. It doesn't take much to throw it off. How we digest food. If I'm under stress, I will spare you the details, but I definitely, my tummy definitely lets me know when I'm feeling anxious about something. And of course, in the past 2 years, we have all become immunologists and like disease experts on the internet. And so our immune system absolutely gets lowered when we are under chronic stress. So again, none of these things are really new ideas, but it's easy to lose track of how global this can be for someone. And I want you to think about, again, especially for maybe I think some of your older people too, how often they get in trouble at school or at work or whatever because of the headache or the stomach ache that people think they're faking. Now, they may absolutely be faking it, but what I think is more likely for many of them is that they really are experiencing emotional distress, but they're experiencing it in the body. And about 30% of the population, if I interviewed you guys, so just general population, if I sat down with each one of you guys, about 30% of you would be less aware of emotional distress as emotions, right? So you'd be less likely to tell me that you feel sad or scared or depressed or anxious, but you would say, but I do have this headache I can't get rid of. Or my IBS is flaring up. About 30% of the population just experiences emotions more somatically. We all have emotion in our body. That's where it is. But some of the folks you work with will have gotten a lot of crap for this and been told that they're faking it when the school nurse couldn't find anything wrong, or the headache that doesn't seem to respond to treatment. And what you may actually be seeing is someone who carries a lot of distress in their body. Okay, again, this stuff, I could go on and on, but you guys kind of get it. This next one. How you react, think, judge the intentions and actions of others, solve problems, get your needs met, and imagine your future. Okay, this is a little checklist, and most, if not every woman you work with will check off, bing, 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 like every one of these, right? So go back to our example with Tamika and the shirts, right? So when Tamika walks in and I'm like, boom, have I reacted quickly? Yeah, much too quickly, right? Did I accurately think and judge her intention? No. And there were so many young people I worked with, for example, where, someone bumps them in the hallway by accident and, oh, that's it, right? We're done. Or many of you guys may have worked in settings where someone just told you, right? Like, hey, if you come up behind Vanessa, don't put your hand on her shoulder before she sees you because she's going to turn around swinging or whatever. Or they go the other way. And especially we may see young women who do this, who, the guy who talks to them nicely for 5 minutes, that's their new boyfriend. Ugh. So our ability, and I think this has to do again with that ability to be in touch with our own feelings and our own sensations. Van der Kolk likes to say, if you don't know what you feel, you can't know what you're doing. Right. So we don't have that intuition. We don't have that warning that says this person is not good news for me, or this person's not a threat. I did not need to punch them in the face because they bumped into me, that kind of thing. And it very quickly, this ripples out, and you can see how this affects everything about a person's life. There were so many people that I worked with, young adults, where I would think, oh man, if you'd had 2 more seconds to think before you threw that punch at the cop, or before you threw that chair at the teacher, or before you stormed off that job site, or whatever it was. So this can really start to affect everything about someone's life, not just a trigger. There's more. I'll try to go through it quickly. This one we've already talked about, how you understand emotions and empathy, not just your emotions, but the emotions of everybody. And if you don't understand emotion and you lack empathy, it makes you a huge jerk and very difficult for other people to be around. This last one, how you take risks, tolerate discomfort, trust others, and experience intimacy. The last 2 we sort of already talked about, but the first 2 I think are so important. One of the things I learned as a social worker in many different settings, working with people, is it's easy for staff, and those of you who are supervisors, this is really important to remember and to support your staff with. It's easy for us to forget how risky the things we're asking our clients to do feel to them. Now, we know that sticking it out at a job where they're frustrated or bored, or talking to the building manager about the problem they're having, or whatever it is, setting boundaries with the boyfriend, whatever it might be. For us, it may not seem like that big of a deal, but for them, it can feel like a huge, huge risk or deeply uncomfortable. I was really aware of this when I supervised staff, and they were constantly telling young people how to solve conflicts peacefully, which is great, right? Use your words, talk about your feelings, blah, blah, blah. Did they do that with each other? No, right? There were grudges and people didn't bring things up and blah, 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 and talk behind each other's back. So I was constantly encouraging the staff to use the skills that they were busy encouraging young people to use. And I thought that was a good empathy experience, that it's not so easy, is it? It's not so easy to sit down and have that tough conversation. It's not so easy to calm yourself down and make that apology or whatever it is. So for us to be able to do that as human beings, we have to have some sort of solid base to go back to, some kind of foundation within ourselves where we go, okay, I can do this, and do the scary thing. When we don't have that, it's much, much harder. And again, this is where I think we start seeing people as resistant. When I taught my clinical students, we talked a lot about resistance. I think resistance is bullshit. I probably shouldn't say that. I think resistance is BS. Sorry about that. I think resistance is someone trying to manage the world to keep themselves feeling safe. And whether you're a therapist or a social worker or a manager or a staff person, your job is to figure that out and join with them, not write them off as resistant. I don't know anyone who wants to make their life harder, even though some of the folks we work with seem like that's their job every single day, is making the worst decision possible to make their life harder. But also really what they're doing is they're trying to feel safe inside. Get it? So this may seem like a small point, but actually it's the whole ball game for a lot of the situations that you or your staff might find yourselves in with some of these moms. Oh yes, and this last one, I do have to spend a moment on this. How we feel inside ourselves and how we see ourselves reflected by other people means everything in terms of how we see ourselves, our own worth, and the worth of other human beings. And some of the ways that our individuals, some of the women that you will work with, and honestly, sometimes some of your staff people, what they have been told very clearly, either by the behavior of other people or often the words of other people, is you have no worth at all. And here's a tricky thing. It's easy for us to think about this, especially with women, when we believe that they have been, just to use this term, the victims of mistreatment or abuse. It is harder to recognize when they may have sustained what we sometimes call moral injury, if they have been coerced or participated in the victimization of other people. And often when we're talking about severe trauma, long-term trauma, victimization, and exploitation, they will have been encouraged or required to behave badly to other people. Or their trauma has led them to treat everybody that way. And so it's, if you're having these conversations, and I understand you guys are not going to be doing trauma therapy with people, but sometimes you're the person they're going to trust, right? This is the conversation you might be having. Being able to understand that they may think about themselves based on things they have done, not just what was done to them. But it doesn't take much of these kinds of experiences to make you feel like you have no worth at all. And so here we really see that trauma isn't a trigger. A trigger may be part of it for sure. And as I said, if you can identify them and kind of plan for that or work with that, that's great. But for some, maybe many of the people you work with, trauma is seawater. It got in everywhere. And how people understand them, how people see them, how people diagnose them, what's written down about them, everything has been affected by the trauma that they may have experienced. And here I really want to get to what I think the heart of traumatic injury can be. And that is something that threatens connection. So again, you guys, I think of as being there for kids as well as moms, right? And for young children, what is existentially threatening for them, what is life or death for them, is the connection with a stable caregiving adult, right? Doesn't have to be the world's most perfect mom. I raised 2 kids. God knows they will be the first ones to tell you it was not a gold star every day. But a mom who's basically okay, a mom who is keeping her anxiety and depression treated, a mom where, you know, food scarcity is not consuming her every thought every day or where they're going to sleep. You guys get it. I don't have to preach to you. That is the mom who can maintain that connection. And I don't want to dismiss dads or grandparents or anybody else. I'm just saying, whoever that caregiver is for that child, when that connection is threatened, that is trauma inducing for young children. Forget any other kind of maltreatment or abuse. That connection is a matter of life and death for them. For young people, it's about the social group. Have they been rejected? Have they been exploited? Have they been bullied? Many of the young women you work with will have experienced all of that stuff. And for adults, often it's loss. So again, this would be a training for another day, but talking about the traumatic elements of grief and loss, I think would be really important as well. Anyway, so again, going back to that comment I made earlier, trauma isn't always what we think it is. It's not always the rape or the mugging or the whatever, the car accident. Sometimes it's the threat to connection. Okay, I've already talked about this, but I'll just mention it. Again, why I'm so grateful you guys are doing this. There are infinite causes of trauma. The way I sometimes explain this is that if you go to the doctor because you fell off your skateboard and you have a broken arm, you guys look young to me. Probably some of you guys skateboard. I don't know. The doctor doesn't care, like, what, she's not going to ask you, what color is the skateboard? Doesn't matter. There are a billion ways to break an arm, right? All the doctor wants to know is what kind of break it was. And there are only like 3 or 4 different kinds, and how to treat it. And I think of trauma, to sum up the whole, like, trauma could be lots of things conversation, maybe think about it this way. There are infinite stresses that a human being could experience that could potentially cause trauma, but there are only so many ways that our bodies and brains can react to it. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Trauma is worse for kids than adults generally. So if you, for example, if you have someone in your program who had a pretty stable childhood and who did not have major trauma throughout their developmental years, either big or little t, then if they experience trauma as an adult, they experience an assault or a car accident or whatever, chances are they are going to be more resilient and have a better outcome with treatment than someone who experienced trauma early on in life. And a huge number of your folks have experienced trauma from the get-go, to be honest with you. Trauma that has been caused by another human being is worse than something that's impersonal. So again, being a victim of something that another human being did to you is much worse, much more damaging than a natural disaster. And we'll talk about the special dilemma, the problem that creates. And you guys are often going to be on the front line of helping someone work through that trap. I guess I'll just tell you now, here's the trap. The thing that helps people heal from trauma is trusting relationships with other human beings. Nobody heals from trauma all by themselves on an island. They just don't. So to go back to Rachel's example with the vets, there's a lot of individual work that needs to happen from trauma healing, but group work is so incredibly important for reasons that are specific to combat trauma that we won't get into. But some of the reasons are that you need to know that other human beings care about you. You need to know that other human beings see you as valuable. You need to experience other human beings as trusting. But the original cause of your wound was human beings. It's a terrible dilemma. It's like if someone poisoned you and you've had the effects of the poisoning, and now they're going to give you the medicine to cure it, but it's the same thing. So again, when we talk about someone being resistant or oppositional, or if we're really upset with them, we call them borderline. What we're not fully appreciating, I think, is what a terrible trap that is, what a terrible dilemma that is, that in order to heal, they really do need to form these relationships. But it's terrifying because it was in relationship that they were hurt. As many of you guys already know, most of the traumas you guys deal with, I'm going to go ahead and say most of the traumas were caused by people they know. It was usually not the guy in the bushes. That certainly can happen, but that's typically not the context in which it occurred. So we are asking them to heal in the same context in which they were hurt. And I believe that with kindness and patience, many people will get there and will eventually be able to build some of that trust, but it takes a lot of patience, right? So I think if we deeply appreciate what it is we're really asking them to do, it kind of helps with our frustration and our impatience with them. And because again, let me make it very clear, people can be super obnoxious. So I definitely get that. But I think staying grounded in this understanding can be helpful. Okay, I'm watching the time. It's totally getting away. So let me talk about a couple more things. I've already touched on a lot of these things, and you guys are not going to be doing trauma, PTSD diagnoses. So I'm not going to take you through a ton of this, but I did want you to be familiar. If someone has been diagnosed with PTSD, what happened was they were assessed to have a certain number of these things. And some of my mental health folks know this. Usually it's like 5 out of 9 or 6 out of 10 or something in 4 of these areas. Okay. So the first one we've largely talked about, hypervigilance. That just means you're always on red alert. Okay. So we see this in people in terms of, like I described, Tamika walks in, I'm triggered, boom, I've hit her long before anybody, can say anything or anyone knows what's going on. So it can be very, very quick. And I'm kind of always primed for that, right? We may see that in terms of irritability or quick aggression. You'll see it in terms of like pacing and rocking, stuff like that. If you've ever worked with folks on the autism spectrum, you'll see more body language that kind of shows that. It's also where I think we see a lot of that, the impact on the body of constant stress. So people will have chronic headaches, tooth grinding, digestive issues, reflux. There's a bunch of stuff that we see because their body can never relax. When I worked with teenagers in residential treatment, there was a constant power struggle because they wanted to stay up all night and sleep all day. Now, some of that is just natural to teenagers because they're kind of vampires. But some of it is that they really had trouble falling asleep because they're wound all the time. And my guess is trouble sleeping is a complaint you're going to hear a lot from people. So that's hypervigilance. They're always on red alert. These are the people, by the way, that if you're talking to them, you don't want to back them into a corner or cut off their view of the exit because they will freak out and possibly punch you. And here's where I feel like I want to take a break just for a moment and share with you from my heart my guiding principle as a social worker for the past 30 years. I pass this on to all of my students, and I want to share it now with you. My one rule for you before anything else: don't get punched in the face. That's it. I don't want you to get punched in the face. I don't want anyone to punch me in the face. And I will tell you the number of times that a kid or an adult would say, "You'd better back up or I'm going to punch you." And people don't move. And I'm like, dude, what? So my reaction was always like, thanks. Thank you for letting me know. I can absolutely back up. Is this far enough? Do you need me to go farther? Because I can move back farther. Don't get punched in the face. Okay. So these are the punchers, the people who are hypervigilant. Avoidance, this used to be called constriction, for anybody who was trained with the DSM-4. Really, all this means is that you make yourself and your world smaller and smaller and smaller to control it and to avoid being triggered. So think about that example of the veteran who doesn't go to the fireworks and doesn't go around crowds and doesn't go outside during the day, and then they're at home by themselves with the blinds drawn all day long. That's avoidance. Their world is getting smaller and smaller. If you do end up working with anybody on the autism spectrum, or if you have mothers with kids on the autism spectrum, sometimes we see similar things, and it's due to anxiety and a desire to avoid agitation. So the baby, let's say the toddler who flips out because they were expecting pudding and they got applesauce, or the texture of the shirt is itchy and they're spazzing out, it can look really petty, but really it's about avoidance. It's about trying to avoid that agitation. Okay. Intrusion, this is what we kind of think of when we think of like flashbacks or nightmares. It's the traumatic experience intruding where it doesn't belong. I was talking with a young woman in high school once, and she said, it's not like I'm always thinking about the abuse. Sometimes I'm sitting in math class and I'm thinking about math, and then suddenly there's a disgusting movie in my head. So intrusive thoughts, this is why I think people with PTSD sometimes are misdiagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder, although of course you can have both. Interestingly, nightmares is one of the only symptoms of trauma, specific to trauma, that we can treat with medication. There is a medication called Prazosin, and it doesn't work for everyone, but for some people with nightmares from trauma, it really does help to minimize the nightmares. So if you're working with a mom who's having trouble with nightmares, and this has not been discussed with her, that's a possibility to think about. And then the last one, the DSM manages to make this sound really fun. They said it in the driest way possible. Negative alterations in cognition and mood just mean that trauma can really affect how you think about things, and it can really take a toll on your mood. It can make you really depressed and anxious. So yeah, that's true. So if you see someone who's been diagnosed with PTSD, that is what someone looked at and assessed as being present for them to have this diagnosis. And I've got some things in here that go into this, but we're not going to spend time on that. Okay, so we're going to just do a little bit more here, talking about what are our reactions as mammals, as living organisms. How do we react to a threat? And I think this will be a good place for us to stop when we go through this a little bit, because I'll ask you guys to do something between now and tomorrow. And we'll leave a few minutes for comments and questions as well. So any organism has a means of dealing with a threat. Okay, even if like in high school you ever had like a little amoeba on a slide that you had to look at, the amoeba can contract when the liquid around it isn't hospitable, or it can stretch out and get all thin and stretchy when it likes the environment it's in. And I bet you didn't think that I was going to be acting like an amoeba for your training today. You're welcome. That was the theater portion of the day. So every organism, from the most simple up to, pretty complicated, like mammals and primates, we have ways to deal with if our environment isn't safe for us. And some of these are very familiar to us, right? Fight or flight. We all kind of get it, okay? Our brain releases, among other things, cortisol and norepinephrine. That will be important later. When there's something around us or some signal we're getting from our body that something is unsafe. Okay, so if a tiger bursts into the room, we are immediately going to try to fight that tiger or run away from the tiger. Personally, I am not very fit. I'm going to try to run away from the tiger. Maybe some of you are going to take a shot. Good for you. But your brain releases norepinephrine and cortisol. That signals the release of adrenaline and cortisol in your body, and we get that that flood of adrenaline to do what we need to do. In fact, if you've ever been scared, like, I don't know, someone's merging into your lane and they didn't see you, and you've got to pull your car off the road and you're shaking so hard that it's a minute before you can start driving your car again. What's happening actually is that there's so much cortisol and adrenaline in your muscles that the muscle fibers are twitching kind of randomly. That's why it's hard to control what you're doing. So fight or flight, we're familiar with. The next one, freeze, you may be less familiar with. And freeze, if you think about, like, if you've ever been driving at night and a rabbit darts in front of your car and the rabbit is frozen until you swerve around it, boom, and then it takes off. That rabbit is still, but at a high state of activation, okay? So they're filled with adrenaline and cortisol, and as soon as you swerve out of the way or the hawk flies over or whatever, boom, they're going to take off. So they're still very activated, but they're still. That's going to be important in a minute. The last one you may be less familiar with. And this one, fawn, staying with our animal theme, it doesn't refer to a baby deer. It means moving closer to the threat to neutralize it. So smiling, laughing, flattering, becoming overly submissive, overly compliant, placating, soothing, friendly, seductive, sexual, whatever. These are all still threat reactions. They are survival protocols. It's just that I'm going to, instead of trying to get away or to fight it, I'm going to try to soothe or calm the threat, which means it's a person usually, right? And we can see both male and female identifying people do this, but it's already kind of socialized into women and girls. So you guys in particular may see a lot of this. And especially in context of like relationship violence, we may be more likely to see fawning. You may also see this, and it could certainly happen also with women, but especially talking to the dudes in the room. If a female client is suddenly being very, very friendly or flirtatious or sexual or overly compliant or whatever, we tend to call that manipulating, which drives me crazy. What really we're seeing is this person is scared, they're triggered. And this is, whether they're conscious of it or not, this is them trying to manage and neutralize what they find to be threatening, okay? And all of these are when we are activated to try to get away or to try to do something. But there's another reaction that is a way to kind of minimize our distress in the face of a threat we can't do anything about. And that is collapsing and dissociating. So go back to the example of the rabbit, okay? When the rabbit is in front of your car, if you stop to look at it, you could almost see it vibrating. It's so energized and ready to take off. Well, now imagine that rabbit has been caught by a wolf. The rabbit wouldn't be stiff in the wolf's jaws, it would be limp. Because as a prey animal, if I'm about to be eaten, I don't need to stick around for that. I am happy to check out for that, right? So I go limp, I'm shut down. You can almost see that there's not much activity happening in my brain. And we see this with people. Now, some people will go directly to that response. When there's a threat, we tend to shut down, we get numb. When Rachel was talking about the soldiers who would kind of zone out, that's what they were doing. We also may see this if someone has tried to get away and then they stop. It's not going to work. So sometimes we call this learned helplessness. I can't fight, I can't get away, there's nothing I can do, I might as well check out. I don't know if any of you have ever been involved in doing restraints on people. I did a number of them when I worked in residential settings. And what I thought I was doing, this is a little thing I'll share with you, even though it's not very comfortable. What I thought I was doing was holding people down when they were in a fight or flight state, right? So they were fighting, they were running, they were doing whatever, they were trying to hurt themselves or someone else. And we always did this with the best of intentions, but we would hold them on the floor, multiple people, holding them down until they stopped. What I thought I was doing was holding them until they calmed down. What I now believe was happening was that we were holding them until they went into a collapse state. So we were really just re-traumatizing them, to be honest with you. And restraint is a much bigger conversation. I don't know that you guys would ever be involved with any of that. If any of you have been, you probably know what I'm talking about. But suffice it to say, when any organism tries to get away or tries to fight and they can't, sooner or later they will go into a collapse state. And dissociating, we'll take just a minute to talk about this, and then we'll take some questions and wrap up. Dissociating just means that two things that are normally together are now apart. For some people, this can be really dramatic, like they check out, they lose time, they wake up in a different city, but that's very rare. What's much more common, and we all can do this, is we just kind of separate from our feelings. So for example, if you're ever talking with someone, and for me, it's always jarring, right? When I walk into a therapy session, I kind of know, I can sort of prepare myself for what I'm about to experience or what I might hear. It's really different when you're going shopping with somebody, or you're making a spaghetti dinner, or taking them to a job interview, and they start telling you a story, and it's horrifying, but they tell it like it's nothing. Now, sometimes that's bravado. Again, especially with younger people, we may see this as like, this is how hard I am. But more often, what I think you're going to see are two things. Number one, something has become so normal that they don't know that it's not normal, right? In my book, I actually tell a story where my boss from many years ago was talking to a woman on a hotline and asked her if she was in a safe place. It was a domestic violence hotline. And the woman was like, yeah. And they were talking. And then somehow this woman mentions that her ex-husband was pacing back and forth outside the door with a loaded gun. And my boss freaked out, right? And the woman said, oh, well, it's not like he's in the room with me. So someone's you just threshold for danger can be really changed depending on what they've been exposed to. And that's a different thing. But what you may sometimes experience from someone is they have dissociated. So they can use all the words. They can tell you this happened to me, and then this happened, and then they did this, and then they did this, and then they did this. But it's like they're reading a grocery list. And that's because the words and the feelings are no longer connected. We see that a lot with veterans, actually. Rachel may have seen this. Someone's telling a horror story, but they're telling it like it's no big deal. Partly to fit into the group, if there's a lot of bravado in the group, but partly because they can't feel it. So when we check out, we may experience that in our bodies as numbness or heaviness. Sometimes you can literally see people do it, like they just kind of fold in on themselves a little, or you can see it in their eyes. This is what I think Rachel was talking about, where they just kind of zone out. You can just sort of see they're not really there. Now, this may be something that happens because of a particular trigger that you can identify, or they may spend a lot of time like that. So when we start again tomorrow, we will come back talking about these different levels. Hyperarousal just means activated. We are outside of our usual calm, systems normal neurological functioning, right? So our nervous system is activated. And that's where we see fight, flight, freeze, fawn. We go up. So freaking out is kind of how I think about this. And then the next one is hypoarousal. And this is checking out. We're numb. We're shut down, we're limp, we're passive. We may very well be dissociated. So all human beings can do this. All animals can do this. This is deeply written into our DNA, deeply written into our brains and nervous system. And in fact, they're meant to kick in long before you can think about it. Right? So if you imagine you're driving and someone's about to merge and they don't see you, you jerk your car out of the way long before you fully registered even that there was a car there, right? You probably saw something out of the corner of your eye that shouldn't be there, and boom, you were ready to react to it. It's what allows us to survive. That's why we're all here millions of years later. And I go into that because for some of your clients, or even if there are people if they're grappling with trauma, some of these things can cause a lot of problems for them. And so they're treated as symptoms or pathologies. I think it's an important reframe to call them survival strategies. They're survival protocols, really. They're not under our control. My professor, if we go all the way back to the beginning, my professor did not think about and decide that the best option for him was to jump up and start screaming. His body did that long before his conscious brain recognized what was going on. So as we talk about some of these things, what I'd like you to do, and this is not, I'm not asking you to reflect on any of your own history, but simply to notice, what does it feel like when you're in that red zone? How do you know in your body? Something startled you, something scared you, whatever, when you're in that hyper aroused fight or flight state, what does it feel like to you? And what does it feel like when you're a little checked out? Some may be more familiar than others. You may tend to go more towards one than the other, but I want you to all, and we'll start with this tomorrow, to just have a couple of examples of how you know in your body what it feels like when you are in either that hyper or hypoarousal state. And so that's a good place to stop. And we have, I think, just a couple minutes. So I'm going to pause the share here. I want to be respectful of your time. Oh, we're a little bit over. Sorry about that. So LaShawn already jumped in here. Thank you so much. With rapid heartbeat. Yeah, a lot of times that's the first thing we're going to notice. I'm not seeing any other comments or questions for today, but I also encourage you, if there's something that you reflect on tonight or you want to talk more about, or an experience or insight you want to share, we will give time for that at the beginning tomorrow as well. So let's see, like I said, I want to get you all going on your day. This seems like a good place to wrap it up. We'll see you guys tomorrow at 9, and we'll start with comments and questions that you have. And I hope you guys have a great, wonderful Monday.